first, let's start with some announcements.
Yeah, let's do that.
So one thing we'd like to announce to everybody is that there is an event called Hacktoberfest, which is organized by DigitalOcean. And it's something that Lens was involved with in the past. And so we got a request from our community in the Slack community channel to get involved with Hacktoberfest again this year. So we are supporting the event this year. It's an event which encourages people to help contribute to open source projects. So we have tagged a number of issues in our Lens GitHub repo. So if any of you would like to help contribute to Lens and be involved with the Hacktoberfest, so what you have to do is go to the Hacktoberfest website. You could sign up for Hacktoberfest. I'll put the links in the chat right after I finish talking. And then you could go see in our GitHub repo which specific issues we have tagged with the Hacktoberfest, and then you can help contribute to those. So I'll add the links there now if any of you are interested. So I guess Jim, if you're ready to present, if everyone else could mute your microphones, and we'll have questions and answer questions right after his presentation if you have anything you want to ask.
Okay, I'll turn on my video. So yeah, I'm Jim Erisman. I work at Mirantis. I've been on the Lens project for just about 4 months, so I'm fairly new to this, but I have a long history of software development in other industries. Anyway, I'll share my screen. And I'll start talking. If I don't hear anything, I'll assume people can see it.
We can see it.
Oh, okay. Anyway, so I'm happy to be talking to you about what's new in Lens 3.6. So this is information about what we've done since 3.5, which came out in mid-June or so. And we released 3.6 in mid-September. And I'll be doing a bit of a demo with the latest release, this 3.6.7, I believe. So, let's see. I'll start off with just a little bit about Lens, assuming many people know already if they're in the user group. So it's an IDE made for Kubernetes devs. It gives you complete visibility into your clusters and across all your clusters. So it's a great way to view everything that's going on and even manage and modify things. It's great for people just getting into the business because you don't have to memorize and use CLI all the time. But it's also great for people who know everything about Kubernetes and they can dig deep and figure things out. It's a standalone desk app. There's no need for an agent running in any of your clusters. Communication is done solely by using the Kubernetes APIs. And of course, it's fully open source. So what's new? The major changes, we made some changes in how you manage cluster access. Whenever you add a cluster, you need to give Lens access to a kubeconfig. Previously, we were making, actually I'll talk about that after. And we revamped the UI that goes along with it. As well, there's a smart terminal. We added some configuration options to that. There are some things that you won't necessarily see or notice that were done, and this involves some code refactoring. Specifically for the UI, we made some changes so that it uses a React JavaScript framework throughout, and the way we save context data refactored that as well. So about the kubeconfig handling, previously Lens kept its own copy of kubeconfig files, but this proved problematic because some kubeconfig files are generated by third-party auth helpers, and some require that tokens be refreshed occasionally or even reissued. This means that the kube configs are dynamic, and if Lens makes a copy, then it's not necessarily going to be notified of the dynamic changes. So simple solution would be to just maintain a reference, which is what we did. Some of the work involved, it was a little more involved because we needed to make sure that no parts of Lens were actually accessing anything in the kube config that might not be static. Yeah, limit the access for kube configs just to the proxy, which would do the communication to the cluster. So, smart terminal. The smart terminal is basically a shell where you can run command line commands, but it's smart in the sense that depending on what cluster you're using, it will know which kubectl executable to have set up in the shell. So we added some options to give you a bit more control over where these binaries of kubectl are downloaded to. And also, if you think you're smarter and you have a better kubectl version or preferred kubectl version you want to use, you can set that as well. And then the refactoring stuff, which was quite a bit, is probably the single largest piece of work that was done for 3.6. Development initially on Lens, I think there was some uncertainty about which JavaScript framework to use, whether it was Vue or React. So development kind of started with both. It was mostly React components, but had some Vue components as well. Thinking ahead to the future in terms of supporting third-party extensions, we realized, and also for developer experience and even a unified UI, it was better to pick one or the other. Since it was mostly React already, logical choice was to make it all React. At the same time, we had to do some refactoring of the way we stored context data, split it up into different pieces, user, cluster, workspaces. And also the nature of the desktop app, having multi-processes and having to access data between or across them, we had to provide some synchronization via inter-process communication. And then other highlights, pod disruption budgets, that's a resource, Kubernetes resource that we didn't have in our set of resources. So that was added. Cron jobs added a manual trigger for those. Being able to communicate with pods or see what your pods are serving up is made much more convenient if you can port forward their ports. Drag and drop for cluster icons. We added menu accelerators for basic actions. Did a fix for the Helm charts that we support so that development style ones, basically we were not handling versioning completely, I think. And then Prometheus metric support for the Stacklight type of installation, plus many bug fixes. So now I'll switch to a demo. Let me escape from there. Whoops. That's not right. Here we go. So this is Lens 3.67 running. I'm just showing the what's new section. You can see we've already done 7 patch releases. This, I think, is in part due to the fact that we did touch a lot of code when we did the refactoring, so there's bound to be a lot of new issues that come up. But I also think that some of it is to do with the fact that our user group has gotten larger. We've got more people running it, more people testing it, and trying it out with different clusters or different cluster configurations. So some of this is addressing those needs as well. You can see down to 3.60. So the first release had quite a few fixes. So everyone's got it. I apologize if this is very small. Hopefully you can get up close to your screen and read it. So here's the main screen. First thing I want to do is add some clusters, which I've already set up on my system. So I mentioned kubeconfig. Basically, Lens needs to get at your clusters through a standard Kubernetes configuration file. And a default one, if you have them set up, oh, actually I see I've got it pointing to my, I have it pointing to my separate kubeconfig. It only has one context in it, Minikube, so you can see I'm already able to select the clusters. But by default, it normally brings you to where if you've installed Kubernetes at all, you'll have a .kube folder off of your home directory. And this is where it normally starts. So to let Lens know what clusters you want to use, you point it to this kubeconfig, and then you can pick which contexts. So contexts are basically, you may have more than one cluster set up in your kubeconfig. So I click on the drop down, see I've got a Docker desktop, a Minikube, and a kind cluster. I can pick one or I can pick all of them to add. And you can see it's selected the three of them. Click on add clusters. And there we go. Now I've added my 3 clusters. Maybe for Minikube, I'll go to settings and browse for another icon so I don't confuse them. The default icons kind of look all alike. So there's my Minikube icon. Now in terms of ordering them, I can just simply drag and drop icons to move them around. So like that. If I click on one, I can wait for it to connect, and there it is. And I had already set up Prometheus metrics for my Minikube cluster here. So, and this is the result of those, showing some details. Down here, we can click on terminal. This kind of brings up your smart terminal. And in here, I can type in kubectl version and see what version I'm running. So the client's running 1.18, matching what's running on the server. I can also look at my kind cluster, start the terminal in there, and type kubectl version. And we can see it's running a different version now. It's running 1.17. So it picks the kubectl appropriate for your cluster. Now, if you need to configure it or you want to change it, you can go to Preferences. And here's a section for kubectl binary. By default, whenever you open a terminal or add a cluster, it's going to figure out which kubectl it should have. It will download it, and it downloads into this default directory here. Depending on what environment you're in. If you're in an enterprise environment, sometimes, especially on Windows machines, maybe you don't have access to write data to that location. You can change it here if you need to point it somewhere else locally. And also, as I said before, if you prefer to use a different version of kubectl, you can unselect this item, and then down here in this path, you can give it a path to where you may have your own existing binary that you would like to use. And this would get used for all of your clusters that are in your Lens workspace. So that's that. What was next? I can start looking at some of the resources. I mentioned the under configuration pod disruption budgets. I switched to my Minikube cluster. So this was a resource we were missing. I think it's a newer type of resource. Another way to control what happens when if you're updating pods, it makes, you can make sure that it won't take all your pods down. It'll leave at least 2 running at all times, that kind of thing. But this was added to Lens. You can see, you can click on this and get more detailed information. You can even look at the YAML use to generate it. You can even edit it if you want in this point. And that's like many other things in Lens. The interesting thing about this feature that was added is it was added by someone in the Lens community. It wasn't added by someone working for Mirantis or on the Lens team. So that's just a nice example of open source software, and we appreciate that it was done. Then another resource we have under workloads, I talked about cron jobs. These are like things that you can get running at certain scheduled times. I have one here set up for hourly. So this runs, if I look in jobs here, you can see that it's got track of 3 of them. One was run 2 hours ago, one hour ago, and one just 21 minutes. So it's been running every hour. Go back here, and what we did here is we added a trigger. So I could just manually start this just to see if it actually works. So I could make it fire not on the hour, but anytime. So I'll just give it a name, easy to recognize. So that should start a job. So we can take a look in here on our jobs list. There it is. It was started 6 seconds ago. I can look at more details. You can see it started this pod here. Pod's completed. Take a look at that pod. And I can even take a look at the logs and see what happened. And sure enough, it's printed the date and it's printed hello from the Kubernetes cluster, which is what it was set up to do. So that can be handy in debugging things. Another thing that can be handy to do when you create a service, you expose an endpoint, and you can have a service that's running and exposing a port. So it's handy to click on the port here, and you can see what the service is actually providing you. It actually starts it up in my browser. Welcome to Nginx. It's just a little Nginx thing. But also it would be quite handy to do if you've got a pod that exposes a port and you want to be able to see what it's doing. Pods aren't so easy to get a look at from outside the cluster, but you can take advantage of this port forwarding, which is a command in kubectl, useful for debugging, gives you easy access to see what your pods may be serving up. And then we've added that feature here too. So I'm looking at my Nginx pod. I go down to the containers, and I see that the containers expose the port, and then I can have kubectl expose or port forward that and have it show up in my browser. So now I can see what that pod is serving up. That's handy. I guess one last thing. We were talking about Prometheus before the meeting started. So if I go to my settings for my cluster, in here I see that there's an option for pre-installed Prometheus services. As John had mentioned, many kube clusters configurations have Prometheus installations already there, and Lens can take advantage of those. And it'll auto-detect by default, but there is a drop-down list here that shows you that you can install Lens-specific one if there's not already one there, the Helm set Prometheus operator, and most recently we've added the Stacklight Prometheus installation. So that's what you will see if you're using Docker Enterprise Container Cloud. That'll be there already in your cluster, and Lens can take advantage of that and then show you the metrics as well. So this is where you would uninstall if you'd installed, say, the Lens Prometheus stack. So that's it at this point for the demo, and I just had one other thing. Talk about what's coming in Lens 3.7. Which we hope to have available in a few weeks' time, at the end of October, hopefully. an improved logs UI. So currently, when you want to look at logs from a pod, it's basically brings up a modal dialog. You can scroll through the logs, but when you're done, you have to close the dialog and go back to doing other things. You can't do things simultaneously having the logs open. So we're going to add it to the dock. So similar to where the terminal is, or when you're looking at or editing resources, the logs can be in there. We will have more sophisticated searching and be able to restrict it to time windows and that kind of thing. We're adding a tray icon to make it easy to kind of minimize lens and then maybe check on your clusters just by popping up or clicking on the tray icon and getting to your workspace and your clusters from there. And adding a resizable sidebar. So anybody who's used custom resource definitions, sometimes they have very long names and they don't, you're not able to distinguish which are which in the sidebar because it's too small. So you can resize it so you can see all the titles. And another thing we're working on is an extensions API, and we hope to have at least internal use of the extensions API using a support page kind of as a demonstration, and also maybe a telemetry module. And of course, we'll have more fixes as they're discovered, as problems are discovered. Anyway, that's the presentation. If there are any questions or comments, you can, I guess we have a session now, but there's also these resources you can use. So
Hey,
thanks.
Jim,
Yeah.
I put a link in the chat to our GitHub repo where we have some issues tagged with Hacktoberfest. Maybe could you click on that link and just kind of show people the list so they can see what we have?
Sure. Let me try and get back to my Zoom, back to meeting. Where are we? Oh, hang on.
There's a question we got from someone. It says, quick question, I'm new to Lens. When you click on the link to expose service, is it using a proxy to access the service running in the Minikube VM? For example, I saw localhost 5 something port. And do you see the question in the Q&A?
Yep.
Hi, this is Louis. Can you hear me? I posted a question.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So let me clarify the question. Using the example that you have on screen right now,
yep.
Your MyNginX is exposed as, let me see, is a node port or cluster IP? It's exposed as a cluster IP, but when I saw you click on the link, somehow it pops up the browser with a different port, and you were able to access it directly.
Yes. So this link here is simply what it does is it will run kubectl. kubectl has a port forward command, and it will forward that port to the local host, and then you can bring it up in the browser if it's a HTTP or a TCP connection. You bring it up in the browser, and then you can see what that pod, or I guess what that service is serving on that port.
Is the port forwarding done automatically when you click on the link, or do you have to do that in advance?
Lens. Lens does that automatically for you. So yeah, Lens is basically executing. I click on it, it spins. Lens is essentially executing kubectl and bringing up the link. And
Okay.
I think the link showed up in my other browser window, so that's probably why you don't see it now.
And when you close that browser tab, does it dispose the port forwarding?
No, the port forwarding lives after that. When you quit Lens, it definitely disposes it.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yep. No problem.
Let's see, there's another question in the Q&A. It says, is this aimed at local machine dev or dev/environments moving toward deployment?
Do you mean in general, or you mean specific to what I'm doing here? Like, you mean is Lens aimed at local machine dev? I mean, Lens is
You,
aimed at any sort of environment. You have a kube config that points anywhere, and Lens can use it to access your clusters anywhere. Right? Maybe I'm missing the gist of the question.
John Farrar, are you out there? Could you clarify for us?
I mean, I mean, it's aimed at both, really. I think, right? So.
Well, that's sort of an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, mostly, it seems like a lot of what Lens is currently aimed at is about the sort of tight loop of iteration where you tweak, you tweak a deployment YAML, or you tweak, other YAML basically, and apply it. And thus, affect what's happening inside your cluster in the kind of way that developers need to do, rapidly iterating towards a solution. But there is a level at which any of these activities can be, made both, sort of more operationally efficient and compatible with infra as code discipline, for example, where you're not maybe directly applying things, or you're pushing things to repositories on the one hand in terminal windows, and pulling them down from repositories and applying them from the command line in other windows. Could you talk a little bit about how people in an infra as code regime might, for example, use this thing?
You mean me?
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
or anybody.
yeah, yeah. Well, I guess like Lens is great for, you can, because you can change things, then it's great for learning. So like, local dev machine, that's fine. You can go crazy and change whatever you want. You're working towards a dev environment and towards deployment. Once you get into deployment, I mean, you can still use Lens for deployment, but then you're going to be very careful about what kind of things you're actually changing, and you're more monitoring and doing things at a higher level, interacting with your kube clusters. So.
And these terminals, obviously, they're sort of contextually aware, aren't they? I mean, you can, for example, align a terminal to a particular directory, say a directory reflecting a repo that you've cloned.
Sure. Yeah.
And are pushing changes to the repo at the same time as you may be applying YAML from the repo to the cluster. So, it's just as usable for sort of operators as it is for developers in that kind of, oh, let me change this and see if it works now kind of mode.
Yes. Yeah.
There's some comments in the chat. So John, who asked the question earlier, said he lost audio. And his comment is, I think this looks more logical than Rancher. My previous experience was with Portainer, swarm-based orchestration UI.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know much about Rancher or Portainer. I remember trying out Portainer a while ago. But certainly, I think it is a logical way to do things with respect to Kubernetes. So.
I think maybe we think that once organizations adopt, Kubernetes at scale, they stop wanting one interface to everything. Maybe not quite so much. I mean, this is a really powerful interface, but the interesting thing about this interface is that it also it inherits whatever the RBAC positions, permissions are that were set for you individually on your cluster, right? So if you are working with, a cluster in which some IT operator has designated you one namespace of access, and certain, resource quotas, you can't, the lens doesn't magically let you, see things that you wouldn't normally be allowed to see, right? So it's a very distributable solution for enterprises because they don't have to worry about anything except provisioning permissions on their clusters correctly, and they can give you this tool, right? But on the other hand, they might be looking to other kinds of tools for cluster deployment and cluster scaling and other, sort of heavy duty industrial strength applications.
I have a slightly different question. It's about connectivity. So I saw how you pick the kubeconfig file and select minikube. That will connect to the cluster. What if your cluster is in a cloud environment that requires an authenticator to run? For example, it needs a MFA token. How do we connect and see the cluster?
Well, as I understand it, the certificate information or token information and all that would be in the kube config, and that would be generated. Like you would get the kube config from, say, AWS. It would produce one, and it would have all the authentication and authorization information in it that you would need, and Lens would use that information to connect to your cluster.
Okay. Because when I run my kubectl command on CLI, I have to log in first to MFA with an MFA token. Is it something that's supported by Lens that will prompt you for MFA? Yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't think it works that way. I think there's some way to get the information into the kube config, but I'm not entirely sure. So.
Okay, let me try and figure that out. Thank you.
And maybe, I don't know if anybody else is on the call that may know the answer to that. Michelle, you mentioned the Hacktoberfest issues, I guess, right? Yeah, so I guess we've gone in and labeled some. And I guess that basically means that those are what we think are suitable for anyone wanting to participate in Hacktoberfest. So.
Yeah, I noticed somewhere also labeled as good first issue.
Yep, and that's typically, I mean, outside of Oktoberfest, that's typically useful for us when we have new members join the team, or somebody wants something a little easier to do, just helpful. So that would apply for Hacktoberfest as well. It's probably, unless you're feeling ambitious, maybe go for one of the good first issues.
Any other questions?
No questions. Thank you very much.
All right, well, if there's no more questions, then thank you very much to Jim for presenting today. Thanks everyone for taking time out to join our event today as well. We should be scheduling another event soon to go over probably the 3.7.0 release in a couple weeks. Meanwhile, if you have other ideas for topics you'd like to see, feel free to post on our community message board or in the Lens community Slack channel. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.